Hey folks, David Parsons here, sharing a complete episode of our new podcast, Campus Trap, with Ryan Boyd, available to Nostalgia Trap subscribers only. These are conversations between two professors who are sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're sort of on the margins of academia, and we're trying to figure out what all that means, particularly in a dark moment for higher education and a dark moment for the world in general. So we're talking about what it's like to go to grad school, what it's like to get jobs or not get jobs, and how we can try to be inspiring to young people when we often don't feel particularly inspired ourselves. So these are the kind of conversations that you don't really get at your department meetings, sort of the back channel of the academic world. If that is your jam, I think you know who you are. So why don't you go subscribe? You can get the rest of all of these episodes at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. What are you waiting for? Do it! Folks, welcome to another edition of Campus Trap. My name is David Parsons. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend Ryan Boyd. How you doing, Ryan?
Considering I'm doing all right. Good to be here, though, talking about, campus stuff and higher ed and all that.
Yeah, it's a bleak moment, man. I mean, I kind of prefaced this summer in part with on Nostalgia Trap by telling everyone summers are always freaky to me. It seems like it rains bad news, and it's just raining bad news right now. I don't know about you, but I can't really ignore all that news when I'm talking to my students. And it's like, I think it's one of the fundamental challenges of teaching right now, honestly. It might be why we started Campus Trap in the first place. It's sort of like, how do you teach at a moment like this? Because it seems like, I don't know, teachers have played vital roles in our lives, so maybe we can play that for students. And I think we're both trying to sort of like figure out how to do that, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about this today after I'm teaching a summer class. It's just a writing class, and the theme is law and social justice. And so we've, talked about things like, okay, what was happening in the streets 2 years ago, the early stages of the pandemic when we had the, George Floyd protests that spring and summer, and how that just kind of, seems to have been swept away, that energy, or at least looking like establishment media, you don't see much of it. And I was sitting here thinking about we have these high-minded ideals about critical thinking and learning to communicate and know thyself and all that, and then you see that 6 assholes on the Supreme Court can change life for everyone. I wonder, like, what's our little power here as professors?
I guess it's just to explain that. I mean, it's weird because, part of it for me has been maybe different from how other professors have approached it, in part because I teach American history. So it's sort of like just the conversation, right? Like, it's sort of like we're all the material for our class is drawn from, the march of the Supreme Court, really, and framing that context. So I don't know. It makes sense content-wise to address things like that in history classes, but I don't know how you do it in other classes. I mean, I teach public speaking. I think I've mentioned this, which is sort of like just a basic class for everyone to take, and it's sort of like, a tool that everyone needs. And the subject matter, I often cringe at like assigning any kind of political point. I just don't want to hear it, in part because I'm just cringing at the level of discourse, and the way that we sort of frame all this awful stuff. It's really hard to talk about it in class. I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, one thing I've started doing, following the lead of some colleagues who've done a lot of work on, okay, how do you actually decolonize your syllabus and your reading list, and not just center white subjectivity, in your teaching. And I started putting an anti-bias statement into my syllabus that we actually talk about in class and make amendments to together, that basically lays out groundwork for like look, we're committed. We say we're committed to social justice. What does that mean? Well, here are some principles of how we're going to talk to each other and relate to each other. And sometimes, that stuff, that the anti-racist stuff that's explicit, is like, students love it and they really want to talk about it and they like it. And then I've had classes where nobody wants to talk about it really, and they're just like, it's fine, it's part of the syllabus. And it really varies. But yeah, I wonder, like, I try to bring the world into my classes, but at the same time, I don't want to, I feel like there's that steering things towards, like, being a gloom and doom communist about, like, the fate of capitalism and the neoliberal
There's a real
order.
revolt against doomerism right now, which is
Yeah.
really interesting to me because, I started Nostalgia Trap, years ago, and sort of a lot about apocalypse, a lot about the end of the world, a lot about climate change, and we sort of have been aware of that, and I think having a sort of meta conversation about doomerism. But it's interesting to see, like, the larger social media world rebelling. I see a lot of posts lately that are like, I don't want to hear the negativity. I don't want to hear the we're all doomed stuff. And it's like, when I hear that, I kind of hear myself. I'm kind of like, God, I hope I don't come across like that. And I certainly, like, want to balance. I don't know if it's about a balance between, like, blind hope and optimism, and just absolute doom. But I feel the need for that. And I feel like especially young people in a classroom don't want necessarily to hear their old dude professor tell them that nothing matters because we're all going to die. Like, that kind of shit is, I don't know. That's not the role I want to play, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I try to emphasize, and it's something I try to tell myself when I get, down about, whatever horrible piece of news about a, glacier melting or whatever, is that, the future doesn't exist yet. There's multiple futures we could end up in depending on what we build together, and I try to frame, okay, well, learning how to write in this class and do research and talk to people about things, in the news or whatever, in history or, wherever it comes from, is part of that, building a future that's not a nightmare where it's just like you can't sit anywhere without buying something, the kind of dark route that we could go down, and I try to, not be that, like, gray bearded old doomer who's there to tell them, like, nothing matters, because I feel like that's kind of a lie too. And I don't want to lie to my students.
Yeah, it's like, just because you've given up, don't give that to them. Don't let that be the gift. Don't be the guy that's like, this is all exactly as David Foster Wallace predicted in Infinite Jest, even though it really is. And I brought up literature in part because I read this quote today. I saw people passing it around on Twitter. I thought it'd be fun to share this on Campus Trap because it actually, I think. This isn't David Foster Wallace. This is another writer named Russell Hoban, who is the writer of a children's. He wrote a ton of stuff, but he's best known, I think, for writing a children's book named Bedtime for Francis, which is something you I don't you remember that book, Ryan?
I vaguely remember that title.
Yeah, I'm like, what kind of animals are those?
Yeah.
They're like mongoose. I'm not. Someone's going to correct me on what kind of animals.
Is it like a Berenstain Bears setup where?
Yeah, it's that sort of thing. But this is very much not in that children's book vein. Instead, this is something from his memoir. Just a really quick quote that I thought actually links up with something we're addressing right now, which is like, what do you give to children, etc., and what is the point of education? So he says this. This is Russell Hoban. People write books for children and other people write about the books written for children, but I don't think it's for the children at all. I think that all the people who worry so much about the children are really worrying about themselves, about keeping their world together and getting the children to help them do it, getting the children to agree that it is indeed a world. Each new generation of children has to be told, this is a world. This is what one does. One lives like this. Maybe our constant fear is that a generation of children will come along and say, this is not a world. This is nothing. There's no way to live at all. So that's Russell Hoban giving us a lesson on how to be dark as fuck. But yeah, that one stuck with me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the teachers who were important to me, and I guess the thing they always instilled or nurtured or whatever was the sense that there were possibilities in the world that could be good, even if I
Mm-hmm.
was a frustrated teenager who hated being, a teenager like everyone, or, I was in college and didn't know what to do, or I was in grad school and unsure where my career was going to go or whatever. It's usually been people who made me feel like there's not like a set path for me yet. And
Mm-hmm.
so, so I try to be that person as much as I can for my students in the frankly, like little contact we have with them. You have somebody for what, 15 weeks tops, and then they're on to the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the worst thing I could do is bum someone out and make them feel like there's no possibility.
Well, it's different with high school, right? It's because I mean, with college, especially being an adjunct, I
Hmm.
see students for a semester often, and that's it. I don't really, because of the structure of higher education and the structure of labor, I don't really, get to be that person that mentors students through their whole 4 years and writes letters of recommendation for them. And that's one of the actually heartbreaking things about being an adjunct is having students ask you to play that role for them, and you have to explain I just kind of like come here to the campus and like throw my backpack in the corner and teach a class and then run off to another campus because that's how it works. But with high school, I don't know. Part of me, whenever I think about teaching high school, and I have contemplated over the years, it's like a totally different thing than teaching college. But I remember, I think part of the reason I remember high school teachers is because you're with them so much, man. You're with them
Hmm.
every day.
Yeah.
And it, I think I mentioned one, like hippie high school teacher, economics teacher that played cats in the cradle for us for a final exam. But I think that's an important thing too. Is they sort of like we grew up, you and I, during a generation where there were a lot of like hippie teachers who were sort of exactly in the vein that you just described. They were about the subject matter, but they were also sort of like giving you life lessons. And that seemed like maybe a new thing in education that out of like that authoritarian past. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember back to my teacher I had, for multiple classes, Mr. Bartley in high school, who was he taught history and like AP government and kind of that sort of poli-sci history side of things at the little rural high school in Appalachia I went to, and, you know, had gone to a little bit of graduate school, but decided not to be a professor for unclear reasons. I didn't know. I was 17, he didn't talk to me about that, but he was at our high school, and yeah, he was kind of a child of, I guess, the 70s, but that 60s vibe of like maybe the culture really could change, maybe consciousness could be changed through education.
Mm.
Um, and he was kind of a buttoned up guy, always wore a tie, but he was one of those teachers you could like hang out at homeroom and just shoot the breeze with him about whatever. And he didn't seem creepy ever, but he was also like really friendly, and
Yeah.
that balance was really important.
Yeah, I love. I'm thinking. I had a kind of set group of teachers in my mind coming into this conversation, but now you're reminding me of others. And I was. I was in high school. I didn't have a lot of friends that I ate lunch with, and there was a teacher that was like that science teacher, physics teacher, Mr. Schuster, Paul Schuster. I'm going to do shout outs to all the teachers. And Paul Schuster let us eat lunch in his classroom. And he had like computers that were the first computers to like be hooked onto the internet. And so I was able to like go and just like be online. This is the beginning of like being
It was the
extremely,
90s.
yeah, this is the
Yeah.
90s. This is becoming extremely online even in high school, I think. But that, yeah, just the fact that he like opened his classroom up during lunch and like sat there and it was quiet and air conditioned in the classroom and we could just chill and hang out was really meaningful to me. And it made me think of that when you were mentioning um, your history teacher. It's funny, history teachers seem like I think people often mention history teachers in this category.
Yeah, it seems like history teachers and what, like literature teachers, like your
Yeah.
English teacher. Like I had a really important English teacher in high school. Shout out to Ms. Byrne. She was, my AP teacher and my junior year teacher, and was just someone who put books in my hands and was just like, read Hunter S. Thompson, you'll like him, or read, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, you'll like them. They're weird, and just trusted that she didn't have to tell me what to think about them. Just that I was a kid who that was what I was into. And yeah, it was a teacher like your science teacher who would open her classroom at lunch and in the morning, and you could just come and like work on homework if you wanted to, or you could sit there and read or whatever. And it was just like kind of space that I never really had since, and even in
Mm.
college and in graduate school.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that part of like kind of locating any kind of light in the dark is through kind of understanding that I don't know, I have to remember often throughout all the frustrations of being an adjunct, etc., like why I started doing this in the first place, and in part because it was figures like that. I mean, teachers really, in all sorts of different positions that were the like so some of the only like inspiring figures growing up, honestly, were adults that seemed to like get it and reach out in some way or another. I have one that I'll share. That's if we're gonna do chronological and go all the way back. I don't know if you have any examples from like elementary school or kindergarten teachers, but I was. This is gonna sound like very admissions essay sort of material, and I think I may have used this teacher as an example because when I was young, I had a pretty profound, a pretty pronounced speech impediment, and it was socially crippling, and it was something that the school speech therapist could not solve for whatever reason. I was going to this dude that like didn't work. It wasn't working. So my parents like sent me to a person out of school, like a private tutor. Her name was Trudy Bennett. And she really like, I honestly like, it's this is the like Dead Poet Society moment. You can hear the like swelling Hollywood music behind it. But she like gave me my voice, like taught me how to speak. And to me, if I'm trying to like think back on like what's the lesson from her, like what would I think is the thing that I could identify as what was so strong about her personality or what she taught me, it was that she was a figure that like gave me like a confidence, that like treated me like as if I was a valuable person that was going to live a valuable life, and that was like in a story, and sort of like in a sort of adventure that I could be a part of, and that sort of self confidence that she instilled is something that I don't know. It seems like I don't know how you instill that practically, but it seems like an important thread.
Yeah, I mean, going back, thinking about, I'm public school from kindergarten through PhD, and
Mm-hmm.
I was lucky enough to go when I was in elementary school as a middle class kid. Got to spend time in the gifted program that my school had, and that was just
Mm-hmm.
like a space. I feel like a lot of professors have this origin story, right?
Yeah,
This
totally.
space where we just did things like, read a short story and talk about it, or like screw around with computers in the lab or whatever. And it was just, I don't remember individual teachers really, but that was just a time when school didn't feel like stressful or annoying. It was just a time where I got to like play around with stuff, and that
This
sense of
is like
like,
in some sort of like honors program in elementary school.
yeah, they called it gifted and talented education, I think,
Yeah,
which was
I
like,
did. I did the same
yeah,
thing.
they had
Yeah.
it everywhere. I guess it was like franchised across the
Was this like a
USA.
national program? Yeah,
Yeah,
they called it Gate. I'm gonna
yeah,
Wikipedia
Gate.
that.
Hmm.
It's funny. I had the opposite experience with Gate, dude, because I was put in that
Yeah.
program too. It's another professor origin story is all the same.
Did you hate
And
it?
yeah, I hated it because I felt like pressure and felt like I don't know. I felt like I'd been extracted from the group, like because they took you out of general population at the public
Hmm.
school and put you in like a smaller room with the supposedly gifted and talented kids. And the only other thing I remember about it is that there was a lot of like the testing to like see if I
Hmm.
was truly gifted and talented was
Yeah.
a lot of like memorization. It was a lot of like how many numbers could I remember and how many shapes could I remember, etc. And
Yep.
I have a really insane memory. And I've always wondered. I'm like, maybe I'm just dumb, and I can just remember a lot of shit. Like what's the line between memory and intelligence? Because it seems like I don't know. Jeopardy is like a memory test in some ways, right? But the people that win Jeopardy are not necessarily the smartest people in the world, as we've learned. But I don't know. That started me off on that was my gate experience for sure.
Yeah, I think about like, you know, thinking about like what a class privilege it usually was. It was almost always like middle class kids, overwhelmingly like white,
Oh yeah,
even
totally.
at a fairly racially diverse school at the time. And yeah, I remember taking, I think it was the Iowa test of basic skills when I was in like first grade, and it was about a bunch of like bubble sheet crap. And like, for whatever reason, they were like, you're good at this, so you get to be in this special class. And it ended up being a good experience for me. But I always think back to like, it was like, what if I weren't good at those Scantron tests when I was a kid, like memorizing numbers like you were talking about, or moving shapes around?
Mm-hmm.
Could have changed what I ended up, being.
Right, right. I don't know. Do you ever like think like, could I have been a STEM person? Could I have gone into science? Because like when I was really young, I knew that cause people always told me that I was smart and I got good grades, and I probably was an arrogant little kid, honestly, at 9 or 10 years old. And I used to go around telling people that I wanted to be a pediatrician, and I'm going to be a doctor, a medical doctor. And then like through high school, I realized that's not anything I want to do, and I just naturally gravitated towards the humanities. I don't know. You ever think about that?
Yeah, I always liked, language and humanities classes more in school, and I gravitated towards it. But yeah, I up through high school I thought like, okay, what do you do if you want to be a professional? Oh, I'll be a doctor. It seems like I know what doctors are. I've met them before. And
I knew they all lived on the hill in my
yeah,
town.
they
Yeah,
had
they.
nice shoes,
Yep.
right? They yeah, and then I the summer between my junior and senior year of high school, I went off to the summer program that the state of Virginia pays for every year. At the time, it was at the campus of the University of Richmond, called the Governor's School for Arts and Humanities, which is this like free public program that brought students from like public high schools all over Virginia, and it was just arts and humanities nerds, like theater kids, painters, musicians, like writers. Like I was starting to write poetry at the time, like mainly to impress girls.
Mhm.
And that was what really tipped me away from like, I don't really want to go to school and be a doctor. Like I want to do something with the humanities. I don't know what yet, but like that was a really formative experience for me. And again, it's like the little remnants of social democracy like that were there for me, that the
Yeah.
state paid for this, and it didn't cost my parents any money. And um that's like totally a privilege, right?
It's funny how many people who benefited from programs like that, they find it important to talk about it later in life and sort of point it out. There are so many. I mean, I teach these lifelong learning institute courses to a population of people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, we have a Holocaust survivor in our class. I mean, it's
Oh,
insane.
wow.
It's kind of unbelievable the level of experience they all bring, and they're history classes, so the conversations you can imagine are insane. And like a lot of them bring that up because it's like a public school. A lot of them bring up like the GI Bill, how they
Hmm.
benefited from the GI Bill, how they got like low cost mortgage, how they sent their kids to college. It's funny because there's sort of like this thing about like, hating boomers for getting all those benefits, but like I just want them. Like part of it is just straight jealousy. And it's interesting because these boomers and older generation people that I'm talking with, they all recognize that, like, yeah, it's not the same. They don't have that cliche attitude of like, well, why don't you all get this? A lot of them, maybe it's because they're all taking college classes and they know about this stuff, but they sort of understand that the social and political landscape has changed so much in terms of what people can do and what kind of public programs are available. I feel like yeah, I part of me like wished I had known more about programs like that, Ryan. Like because I was always felt like I was blocked from doing things that I didn't have the money to do them. Honestly, the different
Yeah.
programs that people were getting into, even like summer camps and shit like that.
Yeah, and I think about like, if I don't remember their name, but if the guidance counselor at my high school hadn't been like, hey, there's this summer program that we, think we could like send you to for free, like I wouldn't have known about it. Like my parents weren't, they were middle class from, income by then, but like they hadn't gone to college. They didn't really know anything about like how you get into the world of higher ed. And yeah, I remember trying to write something about this a while ago, and it didn't go anywhere as an essay, but just about how there's so many infrastructures that just like you were saying aren't there anymore, that we kind of got like the tail end of that New Deal stuff
Mm-hmm.
as it was being like, torn up, in the Clinton years and after, I mean, before then even, but um that definitely like made me who I am. And I didn't think about it till fairly recently. I used to think more like I worked hard and got to where I am. And
Mm-hmm.
then I went into being a professor, and over the past decade and a half, I've been disabused of that notion. I realized there are these huge systems that made me who I am, and constrain what I can be and all that. And yeah, and I still like, I'm saying this as a middle class white guy, like the world's made for me to have freedom, but even then it's, you know, how much did I
Mm.
really do to get to be the professor who teaches students about how to write?
Yeah, well, there's a weird thing about being a middle class white guy. So it's sort of, it's like this weird guilt that or feeling of, I think there's a guilt combined with, and I'm just speaking for myself here, but I've heard others kind of express this, like it's sort of half guilt and a half like feeling of I'm like, why am I failing? What's wrong with me? A real sense of like, if I'm failing, it's all my fault because all those privileges are there. I'm a white guy. I should be able to get any job available, and the reason I'm not is because I'm somehow personally failing. And that's how I've navigated a lot of this stuff. It's sort of like a back and forth between understanding my privilege and also being so disappointed that I haven't been able to cash it in. And it's unclear to me exactly how I do that often, especially as an adjunct. But then I realize that there are a lot of people that are not even getting classes, and I mean, there's always someone else to consider in that equation. But I don't know. It's funny you mentioned the AP History and AP English, because those programs, no, those were the ones that got me, I think, to think about beyond just being confident person or something, but got me to think about like actually being like an academic and like ideas and things like that. So I would say my AP history teacher is probably the most important teacher in my life. In high school, her name was Diane Dowler. She was a total like Birkenstocks hippie with the braids and drove a nice car. Sort of was that sort of California liberal, and she was someone who I was kind of a conservative kid in school, so I didn't really buy a lot of what she was selling us. But what she did for me is like instill a love of American history. But I think more than anything, and this is weird, I don't know if you would agree with this, the some of the teachers I remember the most are the ones that like gave me a lot of work to do, like kicked my ass. Like this AP history class that Diane Dowler put together was a rigorous class in the style of like a college class. Like we had to do tons of reading. We were constantly doing papers, discussions, essays, exams, etc. It was nonstop. And she told us that this class is going to be really, really hard. And I remember feeling sick the first day of class, of understanding like that this was different than any other class I'd taken. And this is being what, like, I don't know, 15 or 16 years old. But that class honestly like elevated me in like a million different ways. And the work was part of it.
Yeah, I had similar history, professors and teachers who took my classmates and me seriously enough to give us a lot of work and have us read things that might be challenging. Miss Byrne, my AP history or AP English teacher in high school, had us reading like, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, reading Kafka stories, reading, Nightwood and stuff like that. And then when I got to college, the professors I remember are usually people who really had like heavy reading loads and expected you to be able to like keep up with the reading so that the discussion wouldn't be silly and directionless. And yeah, there's something about that, like, doing that labor in college without like, now when I write something, it's like trying to get it published somewhere, but then it was just like exploring like what's happening in Bleak House. I'm going to write a paper about it, and the work was just like, it was pleasurable, right? Because
Yeah.
it was pointless.
I almost feel bad. I don't know if have you ever run a class that's that rigorous? Like I feel like the culture has
Yeah.
changed in college,
Yeah.
maybe, but I wouldn't make a class like that. I don't think necessarily.
No, I remember occasionally it goes around Twitter, like you'll see like a W.H. Auden syllabus, like his reading list, or like the reading list that David Foster Wallace gave to his
Yes.
students, and his syllabus, which is like, insane, right? It's brilliant, but like crazy. And it's the level of reading and the amount of reading, I don't assign that anymore. I assign a decent amount of writing, but I feel like my students would rebel and just not do it if I were like, okay, we're going to read a novel in a week.
Yeah,
and
I
and I
know. Like
I
you,
did that
it's
in
like
college.
you can't even ask that. They would look at you like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" But I'm like, then I'd be the old man that's like, "Well, in my day,
Hmm.
we were expected to read and write this much." But I'll say this: another professor that was huge for me was a film professor in college. That class was so fucking hard. I mean, it was my whole life, honestly. And the film classes this is at UC Santa Barbara, so you remember like Isla Vista Theater. I sort of
Hmm.
like lived at Isla Vista Theater because and the like surrounding little restaurants and shops where you could get food in between classes because that was the world of the film studies department. And they scheduled these screenings and classes that went on for hours. Because the film studies class that would be like an hour and a half lecture or 2 hour lectures, and then at 3 hours for screenings, and we'd have to come back at night. And this class it was called Film Studies 146. Really, like probably the most like rigorous class I've ever taken. We watched a movie on Monday, every Monday night. We'd watch it twice. We'd literally watch an entire feature film, like a 2 hour film, take a break, and then watch it again. And then on Wednesday, a 10-page paper was due on that film, analyzing it from a particular point of view. So, like, we looked at the sound design and mise en scène and, like, all these different,
Hmm.
like, parts of elements of cinema. But that class like taught me more than honestly like 9 other classes in one. And now I'm thinking like, God, imagine assigning like a 10-page essay every week on a
Yeah.
fucking like film that you all watch together twice. It just seems so far from the culture of college now.
Yeah, I've heard film professors, you know, that I, have as colleagues and that other, at other schools who said they've had a hard time getting people to, sit through longer movies and, pay attention to like older movies that are maybe paced differently, and yeah, I don't want to get in the territory of being like the old man who's like, why don't kids these days read as much as I thought I did? I probably read less than I remembered, but,
It's the internet.
you know,
It's
yeah.
their goddamn phones and probably this hip hop music too.
Though
Yeah,
I do
I
think my
know.
phone probably, the phone that I'm on keeps me from, reading as much as I would otherwise. I waste time on Twitter like everyone. I wouldn't want to be a student nowadays, with all
No.
the level of media distraction there is everywhere now. Like,
It's funny. I ended up being able to teach film at Emerson College, in Los Angeles,
hmm.
and taught a few semesters there, and had really a kind of amazing time at a really unbelievable campus. And they're all students from Boston. They're film students, And I encountered that very thing, and I had to like really, and when I say that very thing, I like students that were really. Resistant to sitting and watching, a 2 hour film together, just anything really. But I think the thing that I was resisting was becoming that old man and more kind of understanding what's changed here. I mean, part of me like understands that like whenever I was in college, this was with the late '90s. So when I was at UCSB in the late '90s watching these film classes, I bet a lot of those students were distracted too
Hmm.
and not showing up to screenings. And everyone, I mean, come on, dude, it was UCSB. Like everyone was
Right.
stoned on their way to like a Dave Matthews Band thing. Like, it's sort of like a world that was really if I remember it clearly enough, I can admit that the students then were distracted as well. But I think it's the difference is the internet. I mean, the difference is the digital like sort of. I think that people have a hard time, and I'm including myself, sitting for 2 hours for anything anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I didn't get my first cell phone. It was a little flip phone until I was like a junior in college. And this was, fall of 2002. And it wasn't like it was equipped to distract me and extract my data and monetize every inch of my life like, my phone is now. And yeah, like, well, I mean, one thing that gives me some encouragement is students are aware of how bad what Jonathan Crary calls the internet complex has gotten, how toxic it seems to be. And they're,
He's coming on Nostalgia Trap next week, dude.
oh, hell
Yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah,
awesome. Yeah, Scorched Earth is great. I just read
yep,
that.
yep.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
excited to talk with him about exactly this issue.
Yeah, like how do we unplug in a way that like, we still utilize all the amazing stuff about, having an information machine in my pocket, a phone, but
Mm.
like I can read on it. I can read the Communist Manifesto on the bus if I want to, but how often am I doing that?
Well,
And how do
doesn't
you
it feel
unplug?
like maybe I mean, it's kind of like a shitty generation to be a part of in some way because we're like the test case for all this stuff. We have to be the generation that realizes that like I don't know, Twitter melts your mind, or any of these sort of social media elements, especially, or even, I mean, beyond that, the surveillance. I mean, you can go on and on into like how this shit has encroached in our lives in ways that probably future generations are going to look at and say, that's fucked up. They shouldn't have done that. It's too bad they had to go through all of that. And it feels like, I don't know, we are in some ways a transitional generation of like human beings because we've never had technology that's this profound in how much it changes the experience of being alive. I don't know. I imagine that's part of what Jonathan Crary is talking about in his book.
Yeah, I feel like on the one hand, I know how to use it all almost instinctively because I grew up with, computer in the household. We had AOL in like, the late 90s, you could go in chat rooms and talk to whoever. It was amazing, right?
Getting those CDs in the mail that are like 100 more hours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You buy your time in increments from the AOL Corporation. And yeah, like I know how to use the stuff, but it still feels kind of alien. Like, I look at something like I see people on the bus scrolling TikTok or whatever, and it just feels so horrifying to me. And there's something about the internet sludge that is really alienating. And I feel like the students are kind of, I teach mostly younger students at a residential college, so they're mainly under 25, and they're struggling for ways to like, how do you unplug but still exist? Get a job, take your classes, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think as we've mentioned in previous Campus Trap episodes, the Zoom thing and during COVID really accelerated all of that. I don't get the impression that many of my students really love the Zoom experience. In fact, like if you look at like if you ever like are able to wander into the world of like student memes, so much of it is like just sort of like digesting the hell that is the Zoom COVID experience. And honestly, I've mentioned this many times. Like, I've been Zooming the whole fucking time. I never went back to campus. It's been 2.5 years, and fall is coming. And like, part of me, like, in 7 weeks, I'm supposed to be back in the classroom, and I'm processing that, and I'm processing that, I think, at the same time my students are, if that makes sense. Like, we're all sort of figuring out, like, what is that going to look like? Because for me, like I have not been there. I've been lucky, very lucky to be able to Zoom the whole time, but also I'm kind of over it, like it's extracted any kind of pleasure from teaching and turned it into a lot more of what you and I have talked about, right? This sort of like transactional thing where instead of like having a inspirational moment with real people, I'm instead just sort of like checking off all the discussion space in Canvas and sort of like doing the kind of work that you would do if you went to your bank website and you were transferring funds from your savings to your checking account. That's what it feels like, honestly. And that's very far from anything I experienced growing up. I mean, part of me feels, I guess, blessed just to have grown up during a period when teaching was not exactly like that, although if I really think about it, teaching was becoming that the entire time I was going to school.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot is how do I keep my students engaged? And you think like, okay, I try to give them things to write about that are relevant to their lives and the world they live in. But, you also, when you teach, have to do a little bit of your like, charismatic show personship to keep them engaged. And yeah, I wonder sometimes, do I verge into territory of like trying to perform too much to keep them engaged? And, do I end up lecturing more than I need to instead of letting them have space? I mean, it's that constant struggle between like how much freedom and agency do you allow your students to have versus your expertise as the professor, right?
And there's also just the social thing of being in a room, like talking to people. I mean, I think about the same balance as you do, Ryan, in terms of like, am I talking too much here? But then the other part of me is like, maybe they don't have anything to say, so I need to cover the silence with more of my thoughts. And that's a really tough one. It's really hard to, I don't know, run a discussion space. Like it just is. It's just like it's really awkward, I think. And even, I mean, after COVID, we're gonna have to relearn that, I guess. Because it's been a while for me to even be in that space.
One thing I really hate about teaching classes on Zoom, which thankfully I haven't had to do since USC went back in the fall of last year, so 2021, so last summer. But one of the things that really sucked about teaching online is if started a discussion and threw a question out, students could just shut off their cameras and wait you out. Whereas like in a classroom, if it gets silent, I'll do the thing where I just sit there and wait for them to get really uncomfortable, and then someone talks and the discussion starts. And on Zoom, I couldn't do that because people could just sit there and wait, and I would just be eventually staring at myself on the screen, and it was just really alienating. And I feel like Zoom just juices our ability to zone out and not be with other people, right? That
Yeah.
kind of special
Well,
energy.
yeah, if I'm getting all, I don't know, social contract about it, it's sort of like you don't have the same social contract with the people you interact with online. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It feels like you could just, and it sucks, but you can just like turn it off and just walk away and like fuck you. You don't mean as
Yeah.
much. You don't mean as much to me because you're just digital, and I can just exit out or block you or mute you, or it's all that Black Mirror
Hmm.
shit, like
Yep.
all that stuff about just like this makes the experience of like this almost like trains people to have a very dismissive sort of attitude towards people because they can just like they don't owe them anything,
Hmm.
and I mean it's encouraged by that. Like I don't know, it seems the most cynical part of me would be like, or pessimistic part of me would be like, it really brings out the worst in people in a lot of ways. And yeah, I feel that in the I have not ever had a successful discussion on Zoom with undergrads. I almost feel like maybe grad school might work on Zoom a little more. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I've only ever taught grad students in person. Like just really this past year, I got the chance to help train grad students who were teaching as assistant lecturers in our writing program. And I did some of that on Zoom, and it was all right, but you have the same weird silences you get even when you have like faculty together, where it's like a bunch of people who like to talk and are mostly really pretty smart. And you'll still get those silences where somebody tries to get a discussion going. And there's just, I feel like for all the marketing that tells us we're supposed to like this stuff and be in the metaverse and everything, like nothing beats being in a room with people and talking about something. That's what I remember from my classes.
Yeah, and the awkwardness is part of it. Like
Hmm.
navigating the awkwardness is it's actually like the weird sort of like undercurrent of the class. The other thing we're learning is how to just like be in a space with all sorts of different people who
Hmm.
might be different than you, might have different ideas than you, might behave differently than you. Like how do you balance that out? And the I don't know, the hopey changey part of me is like, well, that's the work. That's why we have to be in a room together because honestly, and this goes back. I mean, this goes into Roe versus Wade and everything else. Like, how would we lose control of the story on the left, etc.? Part of me thinks like, well, we've sort of found ways to avoid all that awkwardness. Found ways to avoid all that like being in a room together and looking at each other. And the internet really, I don't know, it makes that impulse easier, and as we've said, it's just like it's a kind of way to bring out some of the worst behaviors.
Yeah, because when you have a good, I teach discussion-based classes, small seminars. I've usually got 15 to 20 students, and I don't teach big lecture halls where I have to be able to like be more of a not. I don't want to say lecturers are just performing. That's not what they're doing, but like there's more giving space to students to talk, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a really like risky moment for a lot of people to like be willing to like say what you think about, I don't know, why does college cost so much, or like what happens if they take the SAT away for admissions? Like that's a hot topic,
Mm-hmm.
and there's you read the op-eds in the New York Times by Brett Stevens or David Brooks or whoever, and they talk about like no one wants to debate anymore because of these darn lefty anti-free speech people.
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
reality, I feel like it's like a lot of it is the internet making us unable to really talk to each other and be in a live space where like there's 20,000 undergraduates where I teach. It's a small city. Like everyone comes through my class, every kind of person. And like a lot of students have, like a lot of people have been in bubbles where everyone is like them for a long time. And,
Yeah.
it can be a kind of, when I've taught at
Mm-hmm.
city colleges, for example, where there's an even wider demographic population, like, it's everybody, right? And you have to be there with them, right, at the same time.
It's funny we keep coming back to technology because it's like, I think that part of it, you're right. I think that, outside of this, the way that term cancel culture has become politicized to mean like there's some sort of left-wing conspiracy to limit what you can say in college is bullshit. But there is, I think, you're right, a sense of students that are very skeptical about saying anything or putting anything out there. And I think part of it is like, what if someone like has a camera and like puts it online and embarrasses me, and makes me look stupid, or I become the subject of like, a hashtag or something. There's like, I think that's a genuine fear that people have, but also, I don't know, it makes me think of like, you remember how there was this sort of joke in culture when we were growing up about how this will go down on your permanent record,
Right.
And so like,
right.
well, where's this permanent record? What the fuck are you talking about? Who's keeping track of like whether or not I shot a spit wad up on the chalkboard in 5th grade? But it feels like with the internet, there is a permanent record. Like it does feel like there's a sense that everything will be remembered and it will be like logged and it will be online and someone will see it and it will become like some sort of meme. And I mean, that's the nightmare for me, honestly, is that I'll do something in class that someone will make a video of, and it's not even political to me. It's just it could be anything. And I think that does lead to like intense anxiety and shyness of like, I don't really want to put myself out there because I'm being judged, and I always will be. Yeah.
Yeah. And this has all been just accelerated by the pandemic and the switch to Zoom pedagogy, but it's precedes that. And I wonder what's going to happen with it. Everyone looks at the metaverse demos that they put out and it's like, this shit sucks. I don't want this. But do we get a decision in terms of what technologies we're
Sheryl Sandberg quit Facebook and metaverse in part because she knows what's coming. I mean, it's just not, to me, like who would get into that? Aren't they really asking, like, correct me if I'm wrong, like I haven't read a ton about it, but it seems like they're just asking everyday people to just start playing The Sims and like get into being in this like sort of weird 90s pixelated world. And I mean, I saw this quote from Zuckerberg or from someone near Zuckerberg that was like, well, how are you going to make money off of this? How will the metaverse make money? And they're like, oh, well, people will buy like clothes and items and houses for themselves in this world. And it's like, motherfucker, we can't buy clothes and houses and items for ourselves in the real world. Like, why are you thinking there's going to be this alternate digital economy of like garbage, video game shit that everyone would get involved in? It seems like it's so stupid, dude.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a writer I like named John Warner who writes a lot about higher education and teaching writing, and he's argued before that public colleges and universities are basic infrastructure, and we're allowing it to just fall apart and be privatized the same way the demos has been disappeared and been privatized and turned into like you can't sit down unless you buy something from Starbucks world.
And you sit down on a homeless-proof bench, right?
Right. Everything's hostile and monetized, and I sometimes think I think it was Adam Costco wrote this on Twitter. I don't want to like say he said it without having it in front of me, but something along the lines of like, it's hard to be a humanist without being anti-capitalist anymore, in the face of like how much capital is eaten up. And then you run into that problem of like, I don't want to be the lefty professor who ends up on like someone's TikTok saying something that's like woke and gets me in trouble. It seems different than Twitter. Like if you're surprised by the watchful eye of social media,
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, to me, it's for a while, I don't know. It makes me remember that during those heady days of ed tech and kind of thinking about how MOOCs and all that sort of stuff. I don't know. I was always like sort of trying to be that professor that was like use these technologies in class somehow and like let's write tweets together and like. But part of me now feels like it's so fractured that I'm not even sure like what platform I would use as an example that everyone would know, because not everyone is on TikTok. Not everyone is into this shit even, and like I don't even want to be that. Like part of me is just like, let's all put our phones away and today we're going to read the Greek classics, Like part of me really wants to just go, that's the nostalgia trap, but part of me wants to just go back to a previous sort of model. But maybe, I don't know, some of the ways that I was taught at UC Santa Barbara were really valuable to me.
Yeah, when I was in college, I had amazing lecturers as professors. I had amazing facilitators of discussion. I had people who could do both, that I really, have always aspired to be. And yeah, it's I just come back to that idea of, this is like, Plato's Academy. Let's sit around in academos and chat about why the sky is blue or whatever. But I
I
love
would
that
love
idea of
that.
being
Please, let's
I
do
love the idea
that.
of being in the same place with other people and thinking alongside them and not being in my like little, consumer monad bouncing around the market trying to buy things and, brand myself so I can get something published or whatever.
Yeah, and I think what part of what we're talking about, the frustration, is sort of like, well, that the culture has changed enough that like we can't really ask our students to engage in that old-fashioned model.
Hmm.
And I was always searching for a bridge, like, hey guys, let's make an Instagram post, about John Brown, that sort of thing. I did that a lot actually. And I was like, let's imagine there was Instagram during the time of the Civil War and that sort of thing. Now I'm not so sure if I want to do exercises like that. I'm like thinking it
Yeah.
through because I also don't want to be. I mean, there are professors for a long time that were like on their syllabus. There's like no phones in my
Hmm.
class. If I see a phone, I'll take it out of your hand and smash it against the wall. And you're like, well, that's a little much, dude. Like I don't really
Right.
want to be that either. But part of me is like, how would we? I don't know. I heard one professor just say it like, well, the way he puts it, and this was in like a department meeting because I think we were really talking about this. Is sort of like today we're gonna write with our hands. Like today we're gonna write with our hands with a pen, and in other words, like having modalities that you switch between,
Hmm.
to sort of be like, there are other ways of thinking, and that's going to help us, like in the same way that musicians like won't always play the same instrument. They'll like find another one. Some of the most like I don't know, it's come up some in a lot of like YouTube videos I've watched of like Jack White, Paul McCartney, all these like big musicians that are like, I look for some broken ass shitty guitar to play because that'll help me like find something different.
Hmm.
And to me, like that's what I want to communicate to my students is like, let's figure out different ways of finding out information other than just Googling it and see what that does for us. Stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I try to sell classes and just the idea of going into higher ed and going to college is that, yeah, it'll, smooth your way to a professional career, maybe. Um, Maybe that used to be the deal. Who knows
I love that
anymore?
you're like the
Uh,
first day of class. You're like, yeah, this might smooth your way to a professional career, maybe
right.
if you're one of the lucky
But
ones.
yeah, and what I try to sell them on is the bigger picture of like, okay, critical thinking, getting an education, doing the reading helps you recognize when people are bullshitting you and
Yes.
trying to sell you something. That's what critical thinking is recognizing bullshit and being able to like respond to it with an alternative. And that seems to resonate with students because they're well aware of how, even if they don't see an alternative to it, how enveloped by technological markets everything is now.
Mm.
Right. And more than write by hand in notebooks, which is really cool to see. Like that's made a comeback in the past few years.
Yeah, there's kind of a twee paper culture going
Hmm.
around. Like,
It's like vinyl and cassettes and stuff like
yeah,
that.
I didn't really put that in that category, but I'm thinking like, oh, there's like I've noticed a couple like little stationery shops that have
Hmm.
opened around me in my town, and they all have that vibe of like, let's like suck some ink into a fountain pen and like
Hmm.
write on some really nice parchment, and it's like that's really interesting. Like I don't know if you're ever around kids, but like there's this craze among little kids of like making slime.
Hmm.
My
Oh
niece
yeah,
is
my
super
nieces
into it.
love it.
Yeah. I mean, like, and like the part of me that's like the academic guy is like, well, what's happening with this? And like, I'm like, they want to. Part of me is like, they want to touch something. They want to like feel because these
Yeah,
kids grew
slime
up
is
on
cool.
iPads. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I I can't cite names or journals right now, but I've read research about, human beings remember stuff more from their classes if they're not using a computer, but they're taking notes manually. It's easier to store and recall and organize information when we work at that speed as
We're
opposed to like
fucking
typing
ourselves with
speed.
these computers, man.
We type too fast these days, right? That's that's the problem. We don't think as much. And I'm constantly trying to get people to slow down, and I'm always telling them, revise your papers. Writing's a recursive process. You have to come back and work on a draft. You can't just turn in the first thing you wrote. You have to slow down, and on the one hand, I know, like, yeah, that's right for the writing process. It's how it usually works, is taking your time as much as you can. But do they have space to do that in their lives? Are they working like a job to pay for school, or taking care of a parent or a sibling or something? I know a lot of people who are in that situation. They don't have time to read.
Yeah, no, that's true. And also just like there's an addictive element to all of it. Like if I can't if I'm struggling myself, the guy who was, I was in the Gen X 90s reading books under trees sort of guy, if I can't overcome those addictions myself, I mean I feel like that students are probably struggling with the same thing. It's not
Hmm.
it's not all it's not all easy, I guess, is what I'm saying. I mean, you can look behind me, Ryan. You can see my reading chair, and like that's where I should be every night. But instead, I'm like
Right.
right here in front of this computer, like flicking through Netflix,
Hmm.
tweeting, doing all this bullshit. And I'm like, well, I'll eventually sit down and read. But then it's like, well, it's late. I'll just go to bed. And it's like,
Yeah.
fuck, man, again. I did again, and I think that our students go through that too.
Yeah. And critical thinking, the ability to recognize that this shit is engineered to make us behave that way.
Yeah.
It's modeled on gambling. Silicon Valley does it on purpose. Like, there's a science to capturing our attention and using it. And I try to sell the class as like, this is a space where maybe you can check your phone if you want to, or look something up on Wikipedia on your computer. I don't care, but it's a time where at least you won't be constantly locked into that for 50 minutes or an hour and a half or however
Mm.
long it is. And students seem to enjoy that because there's something so frantic about how networked everything is, and it's makes you feel bad after a while.
Oh, totally. Yeah. God,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. And I think to college teachers I had, and the weird thing is, when you teach, you remember everything you did that worked or didn't work because you're the teacher, but you wonder how much the students remember, like what little snapshots did they take away of your teaching, something you said that mattered to them. I remember
mm-hmm.
my favorite professors in like bits and pieces more than I do like full character narratives, you
Isn't it
know.
weird to think that you probably have been a figure of inspiration to people though over the
Yep.
years, and hearing from students that sort of use the language that I used in sort of praising teachers is
Hmm.
mind blowing, honestly. And you're right, you never know what it might be because I have a student that I taught at NYU just for one semester, and she ended up quitting school after the class and moving to France to be an indie musician. And
Oh, wow.
I still see her on Instagram. She's playing shows over there. This was years ago. But I saw her before she left for Europe, and she said, it was your class that like made me think about things. And I was like, well, what was it specifically? It was reading the Patti Smith book,
Mm.
Just Kids,
Yeah, her
which
memoir, right?
yeah, her
Yeah.
memoir, which is totally a romantic type of book about, dropping out and going to New York City to like be a
Hmm.
punk rocker. But it inspired her, and it wasn't necessarily me. It was just sort of like the moment, the fact that we read that book, and I probably talked pretty passionately about that sort of stuff because I really like that book and believe in it. But you never know. I think what will resonate with students. I think it's very hard to sort of engineer the types of moments that we're describing here that resonated even with us, with that were important to us throughout our whole lives.
Yeah, because you're one figure in the flow of their life, which is every bit as complicated as like any of ours is. And yeah, I remember those bits and pieces, but they're very powerful. And sometimes it's something a professor said, or like a piece of reading they introduced me to that led to other stuff they didn't even know about.
Yep.
It's mainly people over the years, now that I think about it, who were like, do the reading, figure out what, I sound like such a romantic dork saying this, but like what your truth is for the way you want to live your life, and try to live
Mm-hmm.
that way. And
Yeah.
that's brought me to things like, okay, like Marxism, and labor and the workers need to run the world because they have to save us. That I feel like that kind of belief in the possibility of a future comes from having had those teachers in my past who made me feel like it wasn't all dirt.
That's really interesting because I don't know about you, but I never had like a straight up Marxist professor who told me you should read Karl Marx and be a left winger. Like I never had that, and I
I
learned
didn't
that
until grad
from
school.
other students
Yeah.
at graduate school really. But those teachers, I'm going to be real corny now. Those teachers before that weren't like telling me about Marxism, but were teaching me about just like I don't know American history or literature
Mhm.
or whatever. They instilled a sort of like sense of values that sort of prepped me to be interested in Marxism and
Yeah.
interested in anti-capitalism, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the humanities brought me to Marxism and socialism, being interested in people and stories about them and how they talked about their inner lives and, reading Dickens and Steinbeck and, Orwell writing Down and Out in Paris and London and stuff like that, prepped me to care about, okay, well, we need to build politics around the needs of like workers, which is most people. And, that it led me to think about my own labor differently, and yeah, like the humanities led me to my politics, even though it wasn't until like really I don't think till grad school that I had a professor who was like read Marx, and even then
Right.
it wasn't until like after grad school that I really read Marx and understood what he was all about.
Yeah, same here. I didn't get any of that stuff, but now that I'm thinking of that one hippie economics teacher in high school, Roger Hengler, who I still run into at the farmers market sometimes, he he showed us Roger and Me, the Michael Moore film.
Yes.
That totally, when I think about it now, that was the first time I had ever considered like a corporation as like an evil entity, or like greed being a problem in the big structures of society, rather than just like a greed in sort of abstract Scrooge
Mhm.
McDuck greed. Like all of it blew my mind, and now I'm like, well, Mr. Hengler knew what he was doing when he showed us that movie.
Right. Right. Mr. Bartley, the history teacher I mentioned earlier, he had us read in history class, American history class, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And
Mm-hmm.
there's all that stuff about like, guess where all your food and products come from? Like unions are important. Immigrants get fucked over by our economic system. All that stuff was in there. And he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't telling us like save your soul, be a Marxist, but like things like that stuck with me and shaped, my politics, even though I didn't know they were at the time.
Yeah, it's funny because those like books like The Jungle are such like I feel like they were such common texts around
Yeah.
when we were growing up. I don't know what like kids read in high school. Do kids still read like Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird, all that shit, or is that just like old stuff that no one reads anymore?
Students I run into who are real readers have read that stuff like, Salinger and
Mm-hmm.
To Kill a Mockingbird. But it feels like, the Harry Potter monoculture took over like so much
Jesus
stuff,
Christ. Yeah.
and maybe that's more of a millennial than a Gen Z thing, like people our
Uh-huh.
age and a little bit younger. But yeah, I when I run into students who are serious readers, like that's really cool because you can like pass them a couple books and that's just going to lead them to other stuff you don't need to
Yeah.
worry about. Like,
Mm-hmm.
here's Mike Davis, read City of Quartz.
Oh
Like,
Jesus. Yeah.
prepare to have your mind blown. And I had a professor in grad school who Stephanie Lemenager, who teaches at Oregon now. She's an environmental historian and literary critic, and she was the person who put me on to Mike Davis and was
Mm-hmm.
like, he will help you understand literature in a different way even though he doesn't write about literature. And once again, it was just that process of like, do the reading. It's cool. Like it's not like a conspiracy that people tell you to read books.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Like, just I think we've identified something very, very powerful. That I don't know if people think about enough, which is that like the recommendation of a book from someone like in person that tells you about it, rather than like just I would have never found Mike Davis if
Mm-hmm.
someone, and it was a grad student actually, who like told me like there's these series of books by this guy Mike Davis, and this guy was just so like just it was like he was in a cult, and I was just like I gotta read this,
Mm-hmm.
I gotta figure out what Mike Davis is talking about. And yeah, I feel like that those little gifts that happen where someone tells you about a book and sends you on your way are so important, and it's hard to recreate that moment digitally as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like you read a review on Amazon, is not quite the same as someone like grabbing your hand, putting the book in your hand and saying, you must read this. It's kind of a movie moment, but I had that happen to me over and over, especially at UC Santa Barbara. Professors who came to me personally and said you should read this, David. Like, I think you would benefit from this especially. Like, that meant I had to read it. Like, oh, what do they see in me that that is in this book? And that drove my interest in reading it. But yeah, I hope people still have that experience, because those were maybe more than any classroom experience. Those sorts of times were really important to me.
Yeah, because people like that set you up to discover stuff for yourself as you get older, and that's been a big comfort to me hitting middle age. It's like I feel like I understand the world more because of my reading. That doesn't make me feel any more powerful or like optimistic, but
the opposite, actually. You feel even more small and powerless. But actually, that's a very free place to be.
Yeah, to just understand, I'm embedded in history, and this is what it is. And yeah, there's something to be said for as weird and problematic as it can be, like those schools like St. John's, where they're just like, we're going to read the classics, we're going to read, long canonical works that resonate with stuff, that is going on in your life now. There's a lot to be said for just reading a lot, and that's where like higher education is not the end all be all of education. What happens on campus, that's not the only place I've read books or been recommended books.
Definitely. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here is like the best teacher can like instill a sense of curiosity about things and about the world, about the subject matter that the class is about, but also larger than that. Those are the teachers that for me were most valuable, is the teachers that made me want to find out more about this stuff outside of class. Yeah, for sure. And like developing a practice too, like the teachers that were, if I think about it, the teachers that were valuable to me also were the ones that showed me how to approach reading, and how to like approach reading a complex text and actually figure out what it says, how to actually sort of make a schedule for yourself in approaching a writing project. I mean, all sorts of things like that that are still a big part of how I work and who I am, and I guess what I try to transfer to my students too.
Yeah, it's I sometimes think of the T.S. Eliot essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, where he talks about how every individual writer modifies the tradition but is also working from it. It's T.S. Eliot's conservative vision of like Euro culture, right?
Yes.
But there's something about that idea of like a tradition where like you're not working alone, you have other people who are important to you at your back, even if they're not around anymore. And that I really do feel like students, and because students are people and people want this, like people hunger for the humanities and writing about their lives and reading what people thought about things that happen in the world. People want that. It's the market doesn't want us to think that, but it's not profitable.
Hey, I mean, I've done some of those hippie exercises in my classes, and and those are honestly the things that I hear back from students that are like, I really, really enjoyed that, or I'm really going to remember that, or I'd never thought that way before. So like part of me is still kind of like, I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm kind of, honestly, I can honestly say that as a teacher, I'm probably a combination, or at least I aspire to be a combination of like pieces of all of those different teachers and professors we've mentioned as being part of our, I guess, our hall of heroes. But this has been really fun, Ryan. I want to let people know. I want to be the guy that hands a book to someone right now and say, you need to read this, but you need to be reading Ryan Boyd's Substack. So we're going to put that all of your website and your Substack linked in the episode description here. But go check that out, because what you're doing, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're writing pieces there that are sort of meditating on a lot of the things we're talking about in this in these series of episodes that we're calling Campus Trap, because it's sort of existential. I think what we're approaching here, and I think you have some really sharp insights. The latest one that I read is about gun violence and about mass shootings, and that to me scares the shit out of me, and it's something that I think more professors feel and don't have a way of talking about, which is sort of the feeling of like violence being in the class and in school and what that really means. But I thought that piece was really great, and I thought it was. I appreciated the fact that you just say straight up, I don't want to be afraid. I'm sick of living in fear. And to me, like, fear is such, God, you remember 9/11, right? We said, we're not going to be afraid, like they're trying to make us afraid. But 20 years later, I'm sitting here being like, you fucking won. I'm afraid. Like, I'm afraid to leave my house and go to school. And that really sucks. And I thought you captured that feeling really well.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm working on something new for it, so hopefully there'll be a new post in the next few days.
Cool. Looking forward to that, and looking forward to more Campus Trap with you, too. So thanks so much. I hope your summer's going well.
Same to you, man. Thanks for having me.
We'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.